Okay, Chapter 9 covers a very important concept, and we'll spend a lot of time on this when it comes to the quizzes and end of the chapter questions. Basically comparing actual costs to standard costs, and basically figuring out your cost of goods sold. When we talk about actual costs, let me be very clear. Actual costs, just what it sounds like. The actual amount of money you spend to make money. If you spend 50 cents on a burger patty, you sell it for $2. You're basically making a $1.50 profit, but it costs you 50 cents every time you sell a burger. Now, we talked about standard costs. A lot of times I refer to that as theoretical cost. In other words, every time you serve that burger, if you do everything correct, you're making $1.50, and there's no waste, no pilferage, no reorders, nothing bad ever happens. As you and I hopefully know at this point in the restaurant industry, things happen. Everything is not perfect. There is going to be waste, especially if you make soup. You may have some left over. You can't always say, okay, well, this bowl of soup, or excuse me, this batch of soup is going to serve 40 people. You have to hope that 40 people come in and every single ladle is perfect on every bowl and there's no waste whatsoever. It does happen. So we talk about factors used to determine standard cost. They must be the same exact factors in calculating actual cost. In other words, when you divide 50 by $2, if you do the math, it's 25%. That's how you determine your standard cost, and that's how you determine your actual cost too. The formula is the same. So you want to know what your costs are in the quote-unquote real world, and you know what your costs are if everything is perfect. And the bottom part is very important. Actual costs must be assessed on a timely basis. Now, depending on your operation, I'm a firm believer you should do inventory and evaluate your quote-unquote stuff at least once a week. And I've said this in previous slides and in previous weeks and previous modules. Sometimes you do a spot check on a daily basis as well. So you have to do some check and balances to make sure everything's on par, so you can take corrective action on a timely basis as well. Now, this formula is probably one of the most important formulas you need to know as a restaurant manager, hotel manager. It doesn't matter. This is paramount to succeeding in our industry from a cost control standpoint. And I'm going to read this verbatim. The actual cost of all food and beverage items sold during an accounting period is called the cost of sales. It's determined as followed. And think about what that term means, the cost of sales. As I said before, every time you sell a menu item, it costs you as the restaurant money to produce that item. That's what the cost of sales is. And here's how you break it down. And I put some date examples in here as I go through this. Let's just say on January 1st, your beginning inventory is $100,000. In other words, if you count all the food you have on site on January 1st, you have $100,000 worth of inventory on site. And let's say during the week, and we're going to use 1 week as our accounting period, you purchase $50,000 worth of merchandise. In other words, $50,000 for the most part worth of food. So let's say on January 2nd, you get an order from Cisco coming in for $30,000. January 5th, you get an order from Feasers coming in, which is $10,000. On January 6th, you have an order from the liquor store or the beer distributor for another $10,000 or whatnot. And if you add up all the invoices, you purchased $50,000 worth of product from January 1st to January 7th. So if you add beginning inventory, $100,000, which you had at January 1st, plus the purchases, everything you purchased during that week, your total available to sell is $150,000 worth of materials or worth of products. And so everything you purchased from January 1st to January 7th, plus what's on hand at the beginning of the week, that's the most you can physically sell. Now, end of the week, January 7th comes along. Now you have to count your ending inventory. So after you do your inventory, you find out you have $80,000 worth of products in your restaurant. That is your ending inventory. So what you need to do is find out, hey, I look at my sales, who knows what it is, we'll say for the sake of argument, we'll say $300,000. The cost of my sales, in other words, the cost of selling all of my products would be $150,000, which is 100 plus 50, the beginning inventory plus your purchases, minus your ending inventory, because that's what you have on hand right now on January 7th, and that means you used $70,000. It cost you $70,000 to actually make that amount of money in your restaurant. So you spend $70,000 worth of goods to make your sales, and that's how you get eventually your food cost percentage, which we'll cover a little bit later on. So let's cover this just a little bit more in detail. Now, to get your beginning inventory, it's really simple. I'm going to use the example from the last slide. In order to get that January 1st value of $100,000, where does that come from? Well, when you did inventory the night before, which would have been the closing inventory from the previous week, in other words, December 31st, that obviously had to be $100,000. So you push that forward to the next day. So if you close at 11 o'clock at night on the 31st, and you have $100,000 worth of inventory in there, when you wake up the next morning going to work at 7 a.m., guess what? You have $100,000 worth of inventory, and that's your beginning inventory for that week of January 1st. And then you go through your purchases. Check your daily receiving reports. The example I gave in the last slide, you had 3 or 4 purchases for the week. You count all those up, and it equaled $50,000. And what's your ending inventory? Your physical inventory forms. As you count your inventory, and I know on the slide it says for the current month, but once again, I'm using week as my example. You can use months, days, whatever works best for your institution. And that is physically what's there on a certain date. This is big. Consistency is a must when you're basically calculating your inventory. You have to be consistent on your method. Now the textbook gives you 4 different methods on how to calculate inventory, and you'll find out the next slide. I'm a very big proponent of just one of those methods. It's the least labor intrusive, as I call it. And the reason for that is this: the same person doesn't always take inventory, but you want every person, whoever does take inventory, to use the same method. Therefore, and I said this, I believe last week in one of the modules, you don't want your inventory to bounce. If somebody counts a different way or they use a different method, and then someone uses a different method the next week, you could have numbers that are quote unquote out of whack. You want consistency. So it looks like you're doing the right things the right time. So there's no false alarm that goes off. Oh no, our food cost was 48% this week, but it bounced back to 18% the next week. Well, one's really high, one's really low. We know darn well neither one is accurate. Yeah, does it bounce back? Yeah, will it eventually reconcile at the end of the month? Possibly. But if there's any error going on in that 2-week period, employees will know, and then pilferage will basically be easily done. The second part of this I want to talk about is taking inventory counts as close to the last day of the fiscal period as possible. Ideally at the very end of the day, and once again using that example, January 7th, because that makes it as accurate as possible. You can always tell when it's inventory day in a restaurant. The managers walk around the clipboard. Usually it's the end of the night. They're usually stressed out, and they want to get the accurate count as much as possible. So therefore, if it's 11 o'clock at night, you're not going to sell any more products after 11 o'clock, so your numbers will be purely accurate. If you take inventory at maybe 2 in the afternoon, if you have a big dinner rush and you go through about 15 or 20 sirloin steaks, your number might be off on the food cost for that exact product. It looks like maybe some of the stuff was stolen or pilfered or wasted. And once again, you want to focus on accuracy. Now, the textbook talks about, as I said before, 4 accepted methods of inventory calculation. And the one I am fully on board with, and you can use any 4 you want, obviously, depends on your restaurant, on your boss, on your supervisor, on your company. I'm a big proponent of first in, first out when it comes to inventory tracking. In other words, you're going to use the most recent, latest product costs that are applied to your count. So on January 7th, if according to your last invoice from Cisco or Feasers or US Foods or whatever, the price of the hamburger beef is $1.50 per patty, that's the price you're going to use. So it makes it really simple. And when you talk about last in, first out, then you have to do some research. Well, what was the cost of it in the beginning of the month? If you use the actual cost method, which is very similar to FIFO, but it gets kind of complicated. So for example, let's say you purchase tuna fish the first week of the month, the third week of the month, and the fourth week of the month. And maybe the price went up in the week on week 3, went back down on week 4. You need to actually count all those cans as they actually cost, and that's your value. And that's a pain in the butt. So if it's like $5, $5.50, and $5.75, you have to count every single one of them, add it up, and get your total cost. When you use the first in, first out method, you say, okay, boom, we're going to use the latest cost. They all cost $5.25, enough said. So that's basically the example I used when I talked about the stock market last week. The weighted average, also quite frankly, to be blunt, a pain in the butt. You're basically taking the quantity of products purchased at different times, and you get the average. So something costs $5, and then it costs $5.25, then something costs $5.50. You count the amount that you purchased, divided by the total amount of purchases that you did, and maybe the average price will be, we'll say, $5.32 per can. Those are 2 extra steps you really don't need. With all 4 processes of counting inventory, you'll get different numbers, but they're not going to be varying by that much. And when you do some of your problems at the end of this chapter, you'll find out more of what I'm talking about. Now, there are adjustments that basically have to be made when you talk about cost of sales. And this usually pertains to larger operations, as I've said many times before. Sometimes you have food transfers, you have beverage transfers, and I've said this in a couple of videos too. Somebody from the bar acquires maraschino cherries or green olives, or maybe some oranges or lemons or limes from the kitchen, and the kitchen originally bought them on their budget. Well, guess what? Now that goes on the bar budget, so they have to take that into effect of the cost of goods sold. Employee meals. Some places offer free meals. Some places offer discounts. Some offer no discounts whatsoever. You need to take that into account. And complimentary food and beverages, we call those comps. Sometimes a manager will comp a few meals a day. Some establishments put that in the food cost, some do not. All depends on how you do your accounting. But once again, consistency is the key. Whatever you do on month 1, you got to do on month 2, month 3, month 4, every week, the same shebang. And once again, and I've said this in a couple other times, I'm going to say it again because it's very important. Monthly food cost calculations are very sufficient for most places. Once again, I'm a big proponent of weekly food costs no matter where you work, but you should do some daily food cost calculations when I call spot checking, so you can determine problems right away and determine what kind of solution can be implemented to solve that problem. You find out you have a high food cost on a Monday or a high food cost on a Thursday, say, okay, well, gee, I noticed that John and Ralph are working those days. There might be a correlation. Or maybe there's big parties that come in and you're just not cooking things properly. Or there's a change in the standardized recipe that 3 cooks knew about, but the other 2 did not. So they're putting the wrong ingredients in. Who knows? You might have a bartender that doesn't know how to pour properly. They're doing a heavy pour. Instead of a 5 count, they're doing a 10 count. So everybody's getting a double instead of a single. So there are a myriad of reasons as why you want to do that. You also want to find out if someone's stealing or if you're purchasing too much. Or maybe you're calculating a food cost and maybe a truck order came in, so something might seem inflated. It's like, oh my gosh, all this food's on site. We haven't sold anything. Well, yeah, of course you haven't. The truck just came in today. But you look 3 days later, why are we short on inventory? Well, a truck is coming in tomorrow, so we're going to be kind of a little bit short in the storage area, in the storeroom area. So that's why you should do what I call a spot check. And most POS systems allow you to do a spot check. And talking about POS systems and the infamous technology, just some examples of what we can do, quote unquote, nowadays, as opposed to when I first started out as a manager many moons ago. Barcoding, radio frequency identification, RFID, pretty cool. I call those mini zappers. Compass Group uses that. Morrison Group uses it as well, especially they have big storage areas and basically warehouses of food. I've already talked about automated beverage dispensing systems behind the bar. Wireless technology is huge, especially the last 3 or 4 years. You can walk through, scan things. It's kind of like when you go to a grocery store. If you ever watch some of those people, they have the little device. They're scanning things, and you go to even Target, Walmart, they're scanning things. And restaurants use the same technology. Basically, digital scales are much more accurate than those old school scales. The little arrow is pointing here. So there's a lot of methods you can use to help with cost control calculations, just as a quick walkthrough. So once again, that formula at the beginning of these slides, very important, and you will practice this at the end of this chapter. So once again, you need to get this concept down.